So how does America go from a nation that's completely isolationist in the 1920s and 30s to one that's involved in World War II by 1941 and really before 1941? And I think we need to step back and take a look at Roosevelt being elected as the key component here that's really going to push America away from isolationism into something called internationalism. This is the foreign policy idea that Franklin Roosevelt believes in, and his concept is simple. It's that if we encourage nations of the world to trade, and trade a lot, then everyone will prosper, and at the same time, it'll be too much of a risk for us to go to war. I have a great modern day example of this. America and China. China, communist country, sketchy record on human rights. Not really someone that America would traditionally like to be partnered with. But because we believe in internationalism and we trade so much with China, we are able to see now that our war would be too risky for them and too risky for us. It's not really something that you're going to see play out. In fact, this period of time from the late 1940s to the present day has been one of the longest in world history where the major world powers haven't engaged each other in some sort of a war. So internationalism has a lot of people that support it now, but not then in the 1920s and 30s. So how do we get people to move from isolationism over here to internationalism over here? Roosevelt, who was elected first in 32, and again in 36, and again in 1940, and again in 1944, is going to look for ways to get us involved. And I've got a couple of examples here that I think really work out well for us. One of them is going to involve China and Japan. And here's the idea. In the early 1930s, Japan invades China. And in red here, you can see all the areas that between 1932 and 1939, Japan is going to attack and invade in China. All of this will be conquered by Japan. You can see the Korea Peninsula is conquered. You can see that huge swaths of China are conquered by Japan. You could even argue that for China and Japan, World War II actually starts in 1932 with that Japanese invasion. When Roosevelt sees this, he goes, wait a minute. We, America, is a Pacific power. Japan is a Pacific power. This is a chance for us to keep Japan from expanding too far. So what Roosevelt does is he says, all right, I'm going to allow America to sell weapons to China because when Japan invaded China, they didn't declare war. They just invaded. It was a surprise attack. This is perfect. We're not violating the Neutrality Acts. The Neutrality Acts say only nations at war. Well, Japan never declared war. No harm, no foul. I'm not breaking the law. And he begins to look for attempts and ways to do that very same thing in Europe as well. Example, when war breaks out in Europe in 1939, and really even a little bit before that, FDR is going to say, you know what? We're going to sell weapons to countries like Britain, but only if you can pay for it in cash. In fact, how about we just do a swap? What if we don't sell to countries at war? What if we just swap stuff? So when France falls to Germany, for example, in 1940, Roosevelt says, hey, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Britain, Prime Minister is like their president, I got this idea. I've got all these warships, 50 of them, just sitting around. How about I give you those warships and you let me use your bases in the Atlantic just in case we need them later on if we go to war with Germany. So again, now we've got two examples, right, of a way in which America can get around those neutrality acts. We are selling weapons to countries that are fighting but not technically at war, and we're swapping weapons for something else from countries at war. We're not selling them. Roosevelt, as 1940 approaches, steps back and he says, you know what? I think I'm going to run for a third term. I know George Washington only ran for 2. I know it's a tradition. I'm going to run for a third term because I really, really believe that we're going to get dragged into this war. And I really believe that we need to get involved and help Britain. Roosevelt, when he wins in 1940, uses this as proof. The fancy word for that is a mandate. As a mandate that Americans now favor helping Britain when it comes to potential war with Germany. So shortly after he wins re-election in 1940 and takes office again in January of 41, Roosevelt gives this speech. It's called the Four Freedoms. And in that Four Freedoms speech, Roosevelt is trying to say to Americans, look, we believe in things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of worship and freedom from want, and so does Britain. We're cousins. We're BFFs. Great Britain's bae, you know? She's bae. We need to help Britain. And Americans are going to begin to move and appreciate that and agree with that idea. So as we step back from this slide and we look at, could World War II have been prevented? I think the answer there is most assuredly yes. While FDR supports internationalism, America stayed isolationist for too long. And that idea of internationalism, of why do we embrace it? Well, that allows us to embrace this concept of supporting nations that we agree with, like Britain, and not nations that we disagree with, like Germany.